Good afternoon, everybody, those of us who have joined us. I'd like to welcome historian Michael Burleigh, author of this fantastic tome. It is over 500 pages, or no, 400 pages, and I couldn't put it down. And it's a very interesting entry point into looking at history and making history live, but through the kind of access point of the assassin, and it's something that we in South Africa are very, very aware of. Welcome to all of you who are here. Again, those of you who have arrived a little bit late. We will leave room for questions later on in the discussion. And also thank you very much to all our Maverick insiders who have joined us. It's your contribution that keeps us alive. So thank you for your support. And you can buy Michael's book at our bookshop as well. Michael, welcome. Let's jump in. You say they're playing a cricket match quite close to you, and we might hear roars of something or a song.
Yeah, it's the Oval Cricket Ground. It's 200 metres away, and it's India versus England, the opening day of the final test. Wow. So if you hear roars and singing of the song Jerusalem, which I've grown to pathologically detest, having heard it 10 times every morning when they're doing this, it's not my fault, okay? I can't move an international match. Yeah.
Michael, please do tell us. You're the author of several books on World War II. What was your motivation for approaching, I suppose, political murder and warfare and politics in general through the trope of the assassin or the organized killer, and where did that lead you? Apart from this fantastic book and 70,000 words cut out of it.
Yes, well, we won't say that without my publishers listening. I'd spent about 25 years writing about the Second World War, and basically got to the point where I felt I had nothing more to say about it personally. You know, I thought there must be more to life than this. And then I started going global, as it were. And one of the key books I wrote was called Small Wars, Faraway Places, which is about global insurgencies in the first 2 decades of the Cold War. And the reason I wrote the book is very, very simple. I was born in 1955, which makes me 66. And I thought, well, what was going on in the 10 years before I was born? I've got no memory of it. And then for the first 10 years of my life, up to 10, I could only remember 2 big public events. One was Kennedy being shot in 63, and then Churchill's funeral in London in 66. And I thought, well, there must be more going on there than that. So then I just wrote this book. And in a way, it was quite interesting to write a book about just the first part of the Cold War and not to, bring the whole thing up to 1989, 1990. I just wanted to focus on that. Now, in the course of that book, I obviously wrote about, the war in the Congo and in Algeria, etc., where sort of assassination was part of the story in both cases, and indeed, obviously, American attempts to murder Fidel Castro, etc., So it's sort of been something at the back of my mind. And then at some point, I just decided, well, why don't you write a book about assassination? And then I made it really complicated for myself, which was to say, well, there is obviously an archetypal assassination, which is of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And so I then spent about 6 months doing nothing other than reading Roman history, which is absolutely fascinating. Incidentally, I hadn't done that since I was about 18. And you do have to spend about sort of 6 months in order not to make a single mistake when you're writing about something you have got no knowledge of really whatsoever. So then I just took it from there and then thought, well, how do you intellectually organize this, but at the same time not to make it a sort of dry as dust international relations treatise, which it could easily have become. I mean, I've read a lot of the, there was a great explosion of both sociological and psychological writing in the United States in the late 60s, early 70s, because of Kennedy and Martin Luther King being shot. And my God, if you try to read that stuff, it's dreary. I mean, really dreary. Yeah. And I didn't want to write that sort of book. So what I did is something that I think I've perfected in all of my earlier writing, which is to do sort of very quick pen portraits of people, just with a few sort of deft strokes, a lot of which, of course, was removed from the book, I regret to say. And so in a way, it remains very vivid and human in scale. And there's all sorts of little quirks. I will give you just one example, which I found fascinating. As you know, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were shot dead in Sarajevo in 1914. Anyway, why was he in Sarajevo? He was invited to Bosnia to do a sort of inspection of the army. The man who was trying to get the job as head of the army was very keen he should have a lot of face time with the Archduke, so it was quite a long trip. And he went down there by train, by ship, and eventually by car. And on the day before he got to Sarajevo, I should point out that he was an almost pathological hunter. And in the course of his life, he killed 279,000 creatures which either flew or crawled or ran. I mean, a hell of a lot of animals. And one of his palaces had 33,000 trophy heads on the walls. Imagine that. Must have been like a sort of nightmare. Anyway, there he is in the final bit of the journey, and they're going through a woods in the car, and he sees a cat in a clearing. So he has the car stopped, gets out his hunting rifle, gets out, and bang, offs the cat. So this is the night before he gets to Sarajevo, or the day before he gets to Sarajevo. And it's things like that, just the bizarreness of him, killing his final thing. And then 24 hours later, he's shot dead.
Yes. I think, what we spoke about a bit earlier is there is a lot of detail in your description. So each chapter is dedicated to a different sort of, we have, I love that the bright day brings forth the adder.
That's Shakespeare.
That's Shakespeare. And we cover Vietnam, Africa, Middle East, Russia, South Africa. But at the very beginning, there's a lot of detail in Caesar's assassination. And what you also attempt to do, as you do with each of the chapters, is unpack the political currents that exist around that at the time. I mean, was there a lot of a record in terms of just Caesar? If you say you go back to JFK records, that they're dry and not interesting to read. What was it like to read about that episode in Roman history?
Well, that's interesting because you're basically reading what seem to be eyewitness accounts, but they're actually oral memory, and it could be 100 years, 200 years after the event. So you're not quite sure, the really detailed stuff. Like for example, he was wearing red-coloured calf leather boots
on a throne.
On a throne, and the boots were bad news because that's what kings tended to wear. And, the men who killed him were very elite senators who were the ruling class in a republic which was 800 years old. And they saw him as a threat, that he was trying to do something or become something which would have undone the republic. So, you have to take what you're reading with a pinch of salt. But also, of course, the other thing you take with a pinch of salt is their ostensible reasons for killing him. Mm-hmm. As I said, they see him as somebody who wants to become a dictator, which is a very specific time-limited role, actually, in Rome, or become an emperor or a king. They would have called him a king. And as you know, early Rome was ruled by kings who were actually mostly exiled, not assassinated or murdered. So these people claimed that, all the early kings were assassinated, which of course they weren't actually. And looking into who they are, they're all of a sort of similar age. Well, there's some older ones, but they're all men in their 30s, 40s. Now, Caesar was 56, and he would live a lot longer, as it were, than 56. People did sometimes. I mean, like his ultimate successor, Augustus, he lived till he was 76. So really, he was in the way of these highly ambitious men. And the clincher was he was a very successful general as well as a politician. He was about to take an army to invade Parthia, or what is nowadays modern Iran or Persia. And that would have given him massive wealth to buy more soldiers, to give, more freebies, as it were, to the lower classes in Rome to build up political support for anything he imagined. And at that point, they decided he had to go. But, they very grandly said, he's becoming a tyrant, and it's our tradition to kill tyrants and kings, etc., etc. But he was the real motive for them was actually that their own ambitions were blocked. That he was going to be in their way.
You mentioned also, just in terms of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as well, that the invasion would have taken place anyway. It was just used as a ruse. You mentioned earlier when we started the archetype of the assassin. Speak to us a little bit about what that is, because we have the lone gunman, who, as you say in the book, is the most lethal, the methodical person who works on his own as a hired killer, and then you have conspiracies and all sorts of other types of assassins. So is there a kind of, we know that the word comes from the Middle East, the word assassin comes from a tribe of people, but just let us in on sort of, is there an archetype, and is there a common strain throughout history apart from just homicidal impulse?
Well, there are obviously professional assassins. I mean, they could be working for organised criminal groups. I mean, some of the sort of mafia or Ndrangheta or whatever assassins in southern Italy. I mean, these are people who killed 100 or 200 people in the course of their murderous career, and that also applies to some of the American mafiosi. They are professional killers. Most of the assassins in my book are actually employees of states. I mean, they're people who go to work and get a salary and get their medical cover and insurance and everything. And we shouldn't forget that in our fascination with the so-called lone gunman. Now, the lone gunman. The key thing I would say about them is that, rather like they talk about lone wolf terrorists. Well, even the most lonesome wolf terrorist is not entirely alone, because they're invariably acting in line with some ideological climate. So even when you can prove that either a tiny group of people, like the men and women actually who killed Abraham Lincoln, I mean, you're talking about half a dozen people max. Nonetheless, they were in line with a hell of a lot of public opinion in the defeated Confederacy in the American South. They could plausibly have said we're acting in line with the will of the people. And likewise, Yigal Amir, who killed Yitzhak Rabin in Israel in 1995, there was a hysterical climate of opposition, mostly orchestrated by Bibi Netanyahu, saying that Rabin was a traitor, that they did pictures of him dressed up as an SS officer or with a Palestinian checkered keffiyeh around his neck. So a whole climate conduced to that young man shooting Rabin in the back. There were a lot of people in Israel who thought, bloody good, what a good idea to kill him. So you must never quite think, even though it does appear to be a lone person, they could be acting in line with a substantial block of public opinion.
I mean, that continues, almost into, but I don't want to get, to the whole idea from the Second World War onwards, where you have remote killing, almost. You have Hiroshima, which I suppose later leads on to where we are now in terms of later chapters of the book. Look at targeted killings and drone killings. But let's just go further back. I mean, state-sanctioned killing or killing of opponents and rivals is something clearly endemic to the human social political organization. Is that something we just have to begin to live with? Because it's almost like we seem to be shocked by them, intrigued by them. We kind of feel deep down inside it's morally and ethically wrong. Yet it is assassination and political murder is such an enduring human condition.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, the thing that partly accounts for the fascination of the subject, and I mean my own fascination as well as anybody reading the book, is that really these are archetypal hunting stories. That if you take the classic thriller about an assassination, which is Freddie Forsyth's Day of the Jackal, which was written in 1973, I think, and it's about one of the plots to kill the French president Charles de Gaulle. And the French, because it's written by an Englishman, it contains the conceit that the French military couldn't assassinate their own president, so they hire some fancy English gunman from London to come and do it for them. That's what the book's about. So he is, as it were, stalking, hunting de Gaulle, But then half the book is about the efforts of French policemen and intelligence officers to catch him and to stop him, which they eventually do, because everybody reading the book in 1973 knew damn well that de Gaulle actually died quite peaceably of old age in his bed. So it's an unusual thriller in that sense. You know, it confounds the reader. But I think that what my feeling about this is that, you know, we've been, I don't know, we were hunter-gatherers for 300,000 years or so. And then in the last 12 years, we've evolved into being the top predator. I mean, for the first 80% of that time, 90% of that time, we were something else's prey, bigger animals. And then eventually we mastered how to kill them. And then all too successfully, like we wiped out mega fauna in Australia or whatever, or probably where you are or where I am. And that's the fascination of the subject. Now, as for your first point, because I haven't forgotten it, if you look at most assassinations in earlier history, it's pretty simple, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, basically, you wanted one ruler and not two rival ones. And if you look at Julius Caesar's ultimate successor, Octavian, come Augustus, becomes Augustus. For example, he murdered a 17-year-old boy called Caesarion, who was Caesar's illegitimate son with Cleopatra. He just had him assassinated. And Octavian said, well, one can have too many Caesars. That was his justification for it. I love that. And, you know, exactly the same thing existed in the Islamic world, where, you know, two caliphs was one too many. And that if you have two rival rulers, it's almost a recipe for civil discord and war, civil war, etc., etc. So in a way, you can say assassinating one of them was probably quite a rational thing to do in terms of peace. You know, maybe that's a cynical argument, but that's the one that was certainly used throughout history.
Well, let's just chat a little bit about sort of fascist countries and assassination there, and then move through. You know, Mussolini and Hitler both feared assassination, and rightly so. I think it is Aristotle who says whoever needs a bodyguard is heading towards tyranny. So
Yeah.
You have some wonderful insights into particularly Adolf Hitler, because we do know there was the Stauffenberg plot and another plot. You know, to try and kill Adolf Hitler would have been, you know, kind of putting a target on your back in Nazi Germany. But and often you say also attempted assassinations and assassinations don't always result in an outcome that is desired. But speak to us a bit about the paranoia of assassination in the during fascist Europe, you know, Italy and Germany, and then of course, you know, every other country involved too had their assassinations doing work for the other side, in a sense.
Yeah, I would say that actually Mussolini carried out more assassinations. The Italian fascists carried out more assassinations, particularly overseas ones, than the Nazis did. The Nazis did, you know, in 1934, wipe out a large section of their own internal opposition. And, you know, people like Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor General von Schleicher was murdered, and indeed was his wife who'd opened the door to them. But on the whole, I would say they were quite restrained in the assassination department, which is odd given that they were some of the worst mass murderers in history. I don't think they felt they needed to do it. It was actually the Italian fascists who sought out their opponents abroad, who, to be fair, went around assassinating fascists in other countries too, you know, I mean, when they found them. So it was like tit for tat. But I think that on the whole, both dictators were more liable to be the subject of an assassination than they were to be assassinating people in their case. And they took extraordinary security procedures. You know, I mean, Hitler even had, you know, he recruited sound engineers and watchmakers to go round the buildings he was going to enter to listen for ticking bombs. They had special equipment if they could hear ticking. And in fact, the closest attempt to kill him, which was in the Munich beer hall in November 1939, was the work of a lone communist cabinet maker and clockmaker, Georg Elser, who spent about 3 weeks building a time bomb with a very long delayed timer on it, like 3 weeks timing.
I think did he not work on that over and over again? I mean, what you do in the book is actually give an account of how this assassin at the time, with the technology that he has and, the room that Hitler's going into, spends this inordinate amount of time planning this assassination.
Well, also the context was important because Hitler was going to go and give his annual speech to his old comrades. And it was the one occasion where he sort of said, I don't need any SS protection or security because I'm going to be among my old fighters, as they were called. So anyway, this man went into this beer hall at night, every night for 3 weeks, and knelt down and sort of excavated a hole in a pillar behind where Hitler was going to be talking and built a time bomb into it. And, it was a pretty arduous thing because, the owner of the inn had an Alsatian dog on the prowl, so he had to bring food in to feed the dog to keep it quiet. And then he actually had to go to a doctor for the injuries he did to his knees from just repetitively kneeling down, doing all this very close excavation and putting the bomb in. And then it was cork lined so there wouldn't be any ticking sound. And anyway, Hitler turned up and, made a speech. And then very uncharacteristically, because he had to get back to Berlin to plot the invasion of France, he cut the speech short by about 20 minutes. So had he not cut the speech short, he would have been blown to pieces.
And this assassin is one of I just want to, say to those of the viewers watching, they are. I loved Fanny Kaplan, half blind and, surviving the camps of the Tsar, going off to try and kill Lenin. And these people seem to be superhuman, and Trotsky's attempted assassinations, the kind of years of investment placed into getting close to a subject is also quite just, unreal. But it's
also one thing I didn't put, I did put it in the book, but it disappeared, is the strange case of Boris Savankov. Now, Boris Savankov was a Russian aristocrat from the Ukraine who became head of the Socialist Revolutionary Party's assassination operations, and they were a rival party to the Bolsheviks. And he didn't pull the trigger or put a bomb himself, but he got other people to do it. He killed quite a few senior Tsarist officials, including the interior minister. Now, anyway, Savankov then became, very, very anti-Bolshevik because he thought they were traitors. He was a Russian patriot, if you scrape down. So as time goes on, to his horror, he sees the Bolshevik government give away about a third of European Russia to the Germans in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. And he thinks, right, they've had it, they're going to go. So then he becomes more and more right-wing. He gets involved with the white generals who are trying to overthrow the Bolsheviks. And his final plot, Winston Churchill was absolutely tantalized by this man. I mean, absolutely fascinated by him. Partly, of course, because he was a morphine addict and had serial mistresses in every single European capital. He was a very strange man. Anyway, he then concocted a plot whereby the French and the British, as indeed they did, would invade Russia to overthrow the Bolsheviks. And then he and his merry men would assassinate the entire Bolshevik leadership, including Lenin and Trotsky. It didn't work out because the intervention was a bit half-hearted, should we say, and besides, the White armies were defeated by the Red Army. But anyway, he then obviously went into exile from Russia, but somehow or other the first iteration of the Bolshevik secret police sort of lured him back to the country on the grounds, that they might, through a fake anti-Bolshevik conspiracy, and he went back. And then he was captured, he was put on trial, but not sentenced to death. There was a division of opinion in the Politburo about Stalin wanted to kill him, obviously, but other people didn't. And he thought he was going to be given a sort of job in the Bolshevik government, that they would bury the hatchet with him, as it were. And he was kept inside a luxury wing of the Lubyanka prison with furniture and books and nice drink and, etc. And they took him out in a luxury car to very expensive restaurants. Anyway, at some point, either he or they had enough of him. And in 1925, he fell out of a fifth-floor window in the prison. But it's an extraordinary story, just what these people, it is a remarkable thing.
Mm. There's a question, I'm just going to insert them here, Jennifer Nell, and then there's Gregory Denason, who's just asked, what would be the primary motivator for the assassin? Is it money? ideology, pathological state of mind, or just pure criminality? That's what Gregory asks. And Jennifer's is just a different one about mafia or industrialists. We'll speak about it later. So what's the primary motivation that you could see?
Well, that's a very good question, Gregory. Well, in some cases, I mean, if you take an extremely famous assassin, let's take two famous assassinations. James Earl Ray, who was a serial white trash criminal. That was his background. He was a bank robber. And in fact, when he killed Martin Luther King, he was on the run from a 20-year jail sentence. He got out of prison. And his equally criminal brothers probably helped him to kill King. And all he was motivated, I mean, apart from the fact he was a terrible racist, but he was motivated, basically, he'd heard rumours that there was a reward to kill Martin Luther King, and he wanted to collect it. So he went to extraordinary trouble to shoot him. Now, Oswald, who shot Kennedy, people don't often realise that 6 months before he killed Kennedy, he used exactly the same rifle to try to shoot a man called General Edwin Walker, who was one of the leaders of the very right-wing John Birch Society. He was sitting there doing his tax returns in his house with the lights on, and at night a bullet came through the window and grazed his arm. But actually what had happened was, although he was using a telescopic sight, the light meant he couldn't see that there was a wooden window frame halfway up the window, so the bullet was deflected. Now, nobody has ever said there was any conspiracy whatsoever to kill General Walker, who had a lucky break there. But, Oswald then went on 6 months later to shoot Kennedy. And as far as he's concerned, it's nothing to do with money or anything. He had been tried unsuccessfully to live in the Soviet Union, where he met his wife for a couple of years, and even the KGB, which was listening to him 24 hours a day from the flat next door, even they decided he's a complete nobody and nothing, they said, on their reports. And he devised in his head some idea to create a new political system fusing capitalism and communism, liberalism and communism. This, in fact, he wrote it on the boat journey back to the States after he and Marina left the Soviet Union. And he just basically had sort of visions of grandiosity about himself. And then the other thing is he saw this highly successful man from a very big extended Irish-American family, which was a very loving, close environment, which undoubtedly it was. And he just couldn't stand it and decided to off him. And he did. And got his lucky break.
You do write about South Africa. We talk again. When we look at the question from Gregory about motivation, you write about the assassination of Hendrik Verwoerd, the apartheid prime minister, by Dimitri Savendis. Yeah. Interestingly enough, as a noteworthy assassination, and I think for the South African government at the time in Boston, you write about it, Hendrik van der Berg, a terrible embarrassment. Tell us a little bit about your research around that particular assassination.
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought this is actually just such an extraordinary story. Verwoerd himself, actually, I thought was quite fascinating. Going from being a sociology professor to being a newspaper editor and then eventually to being prime minister. And I just thought, wow, this is all interesting. He reminded me of a few people I know in Fleet Street. Editors. Yeah, don't go. Let's not go there.
Let's not go there.
Anyway, I got interested in both the assassination attempts. There's David Pratt, who was a very wealthy English origin farmer, who shot him in the face at the Rand Agricultural Show. And Pratt was wealthy enough to be driven by a chauffeur to the show, where he just walked up to Verwoerd and shot him in the face. But he had a whole history of sort of depressive illness and very messed up relationships with women, etc., including his wife. And then Savendis, equally, who was a Greek, Cretan, Mozambican, eventually a merchant seaman from a very communist background. Now, he had gone to lots of countries in his long career, his long odyssey as a seaman. And he decided that the best way to try and stay in a country, because seamen aren't allowed into countries, they're just there, they can go to a few bars or a brothel, but then it's out on the ship. So anyway, this man decided to be mad, and clearly he was mad. You know, he was put into various asylums, where of course he was then within the country, in about 6 or 7 different countries. And at some point he talked to another inmate, an Irishman called Tommy Tuff, who said, look, all these psychiatrists, they're only going to get really interested if you tell them something really weird. So he thought up the idea, because he'd had a tapeworm as a child, that he would say there was a tapeworm in his stomach which was talking to him. And that, of course, got the attention of the psychiatrists. They thought, my God, you know, I can write a learned paper about this in a psychiatric journal. And in one case, when he was in an asylum in central London, the conditions were terrible. But then he heard there was a luxury asylum on the Isle of Wight. So he hyped up the tapeworm story. And sure enough, he was moved there. So it's an interesting combination of, I'm quite sure he suffered from really serious mental illness. But at the same time, he was quite cunning. And moreover, on top of that, he had entirely rational reasons for walking up to, for disguising himself as a parliamentary messenger in Pretoria and walking up and stabbing Verwoerd.
In Cape Town.
He gave entirely, Cape Town. He gave entirely, reasonable grounds for doing that. So it's an interesting case.
It is an interesting case because, with Pratt, as you say, often, the assassin is made out to be an aberrant, mad person, and with Safendis also being multiracial, biracial, and getting a job and, slipping through. And then, to have someone who was a member of the South African Communist Party actually stabbing Verwoerd was such a breach of security to a state. So for us, that, I think today there's still this idea that the blood patch is still it still haunts us in our National Assembly building.
Yeah.
It does. I think I'd like to just move on a little bit to state assassinations. We talk about Castro being a target for many, United States governments, and let's look at the United States then as a country which deploys assassinations either in wartime or not in wartime, or targeted killings. And how that contributes, I think, to the sort of filtering down that this is a way of conducting politics and warfare, and because the United States plays a particularly big role. I mean, Russia in its own politics, but the United States externally and in foreign territories, particularly the Middle East as well. So let's begin with the United States and its position on, would we call them extrajudicial killings? What would we call them? Or targeted
Well, no, they would have spoken about this when, a president or whoever gave an order to kill somebody. If you take the case of Patrice Lumumba, the prime minister in the Congo, Eisenhower pretty much explicitly sort of says something in a meeting, which results in those in the meeting thinking, right, Lumumba's going to be killed. And it was quite, it was very explicit what he said, which is quite unusual. Normally they'd be much more euphemistic about it, than they wouldn't just say it outright. But no, they were determined to, get rid of, what they saw as communist threats Russian-inspired communist threats in various countries, and they killed them. It wasn't entirely always left-wingers because, as there were multiple attempts to kill Fidel Castro in Cuba. I mean, 17 attempts, some of them utterly ludicrous, and also things like using depillaries, I think they're called, to make his beard fall out and that sort of stuff. But there's all that going on. But they did also kill the completely insane dictator Raphael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. They certainly armed the people who machine gunned his car because they thought they couldn't just go around killing left-wing tyrants. They'd better up the ante or balance the scales with a sort of right-wing one. So they killed it or had him killed too. But I guess they would have thought, well, this is a low-cost way, rather than getting involved in messy insurgency wars, etc. This is a low-cost way of, ensuring that the communists didn't take over. Although, of course, the relationship between the people they're killing and the Soviet, or for that matter, Chinese communist parties and governments is a very, it's a very assumed one. They weren't necessarily tools of Moscow or Beijing or whatever.
Yeah.
The people, obviously they weren't. Anyway, by the time, the CIA, like all intelligence agencies, is primarily an espionage agency. It is there to recruit, its officers recruit agents in other countries who spy for them. That's what intelligence agencies do. Now, the problem in the American case is to do with the origins of the CIA, because it grew out of something called the Office of Strategic Services in World War II. Now, that was because it was obviously the war, that was very much involved in sabotage, in assassination, real dirty stuff, because they were waging a war against the Japanese or the Germans or whatever. Now, because that was the origin of the CIA, it never quite lost that legacy. And because that was the most romantic, Scarlet Pimpernel, dagger, cloak and dagger part of the background, it never lost that as being like the ideal to pursue. So what they should have been doing, which was the calm recruitment of agents and the analysis of the information that yielded one way and another, got left, put in the background. And you see these flare-ups of paramilitary activity, like the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1960, which was a complete fiasco, where the CIA militarized itself again. And then in Vietnam, they obviously went completely tonto, as we would say, and were running paramilitary armies and death squads to eliminate Viet Cong cadres. I mean, they killed 20 to 40,000 of them. These are underground Viet Cong people. To be fair, the Viet Cong were doing exactly the same thing with the government, the American-backed government in South Vietnam. They were murdering its officials left, right, and centre. So you had sort of two rival murder campaigns going on. But this is the state, and a very militarized version of the CIA. Anyway, that has, alas, in the course of the war on terror, has come back with a vengeance. So on the one hand, you've got American troops acting as spies now. So that's the Joint Special Operations Command, which is special forces who have espionage roles. But at the same time, the CIA became very, very militarized itself in the course of the war on terror. And that's why it has come to be conducting its own drone strikes. These are like soldiers, effectively. And you could argue that the calmer business of gathering intelligence, recruiting agents, getting material one way or another, was neglected in favour of this more sexy stuff. And that's what they've been doing.
Did that not necessarily result in the intelligence failures? If you look at 9/11 and what that meant for the United States in terms of the biggest attack ever on home soil, the failure of the CIA's sort of methods of, as you say, they should have been gathering intelligence but were militarized, and the FBI, the ethical and
well, just let me come to, can I just
yes.
answer that? I mean, you can see this in the recent sort of I happen to agree with what Biden's done in Afghanistan, but that's another story. But if you look at the actual fiasco of the leaving, as it were, one of the things is America has 17 intelligence agencies, as far as I know, and they all do different things. The State Department's got one, the Pentagon's got one, the CIA, the NSA, which is electronic spying, etc., etc. Now, what seems to have gone wrong was that the Defense Intelligence Agency, which operates out of the Pentagon, was naturally very optimistic about the training program and the money being spent on the Afghan National Army. They were saying, oh, it's all right, it's wonderful, these are a great bunch of guys, they'll fight and resist the Taliban. The CIA was actually incredibly pessimistic about the Afghan National Army and knew all about the corruption and whatever. And they said, no, it won't. It'll collapse like a house of cards the moment we walk out. Now, then it becomes a political issue. Who do you prefer to listen to? And of course, as you know as well as I do, human beings have what's called an optimism bias. So you don't want to think, well, look, we spent, the better part of $1 trillion and we've lost a couple of thousand of soldiers' lives trying to turn this into a normal state, there would be a type of bias to not believe that it could collapse so quickly, and therefore to put to one side any more pessimistic analyses by the CIA, which, of course, are basically saying to you, you've just wasted a ton of money and all these lives for nothing, because it's all going to collapse. So it depends who you're going to listen to.
The ethical and moral dimensions of, I suppose, modern warfare. You also write in the book of the various kind of methods of transmitting death, whether it's a poison dart or poison underpants or exploding camera, but a drone and drone warfare, I suppose, is a natural offshoot from, I suppose, something like Hiroshima, where you remotely drop a bomb, or the bomb campaigns of the Second World War, where the person causing the death is slightly removed from the assassin who would come and perhaps look at you face to face and blow your head off. What are the ethical and moral dimensions that have been brought to the 21st century by this kind of remote warfare and targeted killings?
Well, if you look at drone warfare, it's basically people favour it, and believe me, it's not just the Americans. If you watch the news, you might come to the conclusion the Americans are wonderful at this. In fact, the best drones, and certainly the cheapest ones that I know of, are made by the Turks. Turkey, and in fact, it's Erdogan's son-in-law is in charge of the company which makes the Bayraktar drone, which, even a NATO country like Poland is seriously considering buying them at present, because they're very, very reliable. As we've just seen in the short war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Turks supplied the Muslim Azeris with drones, and they just wiped out Russian-supplied tanks within a matter of hours. They just obliterated them. So don't think it's just an American thing. These are the weapons of the future, without doubt. And actually, the Ukrainians, who have a lot of what you might call hobby aircraft makers, they've got fleets of homemade drones which they're using to keep watch over Russian troop activity or Russian separatist troop activity, and to destroy Russian armor and artillery positions. So these are fantastic weapons. The reason that they were so eagerly adopted is a very simple one, which is that the most valuable element in a conventional fixed-wing aircraft is the pilot, who costs a fortune to train, and who, if he goes down in enemy territory, can become a hostage, and that's an absolute disaster for the Americans or anybody else. There's no pilot with this to lose, and they cost a fraction. A really sophisticated drone, I don't know what it costs, 20 million or something like that. Whereas, the latest American F-35 fighters, they start at 600 million. So this is a big cost saving. So that's one obvious advantage of drones. And then you can just make them more and more sophisticated. So, for example, we're not far off before they will have pre-programmed facial recognition technology. When they thought, well, we're killing too many, there's too much collateral damage, because it's quite a big explosion, the Hellfire missile. Why don't we equip them with retractable blades? So if you hit a car, these large sharp blades spring out and chop you to pieces. But it minimizes the damage. There's not going to be a lot of people. But I'm very skeptical of this idea that these are very smart precision weapons. We've just seen an example last week where, in their desperation to stop ISIS suicide bombers getting into that airport, they decided, they found out where they were. They came across some of them in a vehicle of some sort heading towards the airport, and somebody said, right, we'll just take them out with the drone, which they did as the car was moving through an inhabited part of Kabul. Now, you would think it doesn't take a genius to think, well, they're suicide bombers, they'll all be wearing high explosive suicide vests, they'll have explosives in the vehicle. If we hit that with a conventional missile, it's going to cause an absolutely huge explosion, which it did, and it blew up a house next to where the car had just passed, killing 10 children. So it's not as accurate as people are trying to pretend. We're because of artificial intelligence, I would say we're just round the corner from computers actually entirely controlling the drones, because they can think so much quicker, big data, etc. And there'll be further refinements which already exist actually in the case of snipers, where you can program into the gun the heartbeat signature of the target.
No.
And that will then be put in. Yes, that's already exists. So then you can put that into a drone, and it will really identify you by your heartbeat signature.
Even if you're jogging that evening, mildly somewhere.
Yeah.
Goodness, that is quite frightening.
It's very frightening.
You do write. I've never seen this before written somewhere about what it's like for the young Americans who work in those centers that are watching, I suppose, targets. And I found it a really interesting point that you've made, that these kids sit there. I mean, just give us a bit of insight on what an operation like that might be like, and what it is like for those people operating these killing machines at a distance.
Well, they're mainly on a few Air Force bases in Nevada or Arizona. They work in porter cabins, about 3 people each one, although they're linked into much bigger teams of about 20 people by communications, radios, etc., and the internet. They can be working in bright sunshine in the desert somewhere, and they're looking at Afghanistan or wherever at night. It could be Yemen, it could be Afghanistan, Somalia, you name it. Or Kenya for that matter. They're looking at it, and then they come out of doing a shift, because it's shift work and pretty repetitive. And you're looking at different monitors, because there's like a surveillance drone which is feeding in live pictures, and then you have a sort of another drone which is going to deliver the bang, as it were, on the target. And you're watching all this in real time. And I suppose I once went to an arms fair in London, the O2 Arms Fair, and I was very struck by the fact that some company had devised orthopedic seats for drone pilots so that they don't get backache, because that's a real occupational hazard, is the backache from sitting there just looking at, like you and I would, from writing at a computer all day long. So that's one thing. And then anyway, when you finish work, you go and buy your shopping, or go back and bath time for the kiddies, as it were, and you just go back into ordinary life, after you've driven half an hour back to wherever you live. It must be a very strange existence to be killing people 8,000 miles away, and then the next thing you're playing with a rubber duck in the bath. Very odd.
I suppose some assassins could have gone home and done the same, but it's highly unlikely. I think the world that kind of, so it does present a whole new moral dimension.
Well, they would have had a different thing, which they would have had relief that they got away, unless they were completely suicidal. They would have been relieved. They would have been, in a very high adrenaline state, and would need to decompress. It's a very different psychological thing from just pressing a button or pulling a trigger in a dark cabin. I mean, that's a very, and then it's also an interesting thing that, of course, it took a long time for the Air Force to actually even acknowledge that these weren't just doing a sort of clerical job, as it were, because the idea was that real warriors become combat pilots, and of course these men are not in any risk at all. They're certainly not in any combat, men and women, by the way, I should say. And then there was huge debates about whether they should receive military decorations. Should they get medals?
Extraordinary. And then, I mean, who takes responsibility if a mistake is made and a school is blown up? I mean, you've got 3 young people, and as you say, there are 20 other people around, in and around, offering support. So you kind of almost dissipate the moral, no,
exactly, because one of the classic ways in which you obviate moral responsibility is to heavily bureaucratize and compartmentalize the activity. So, even in the cabin, the 3 people are all doing different things, and then the 20 people above them probably belong to different agencies, and they're in different compartments. So in the end, everybody's to blame, but nobody's to blame, as it were.
Unbelievable.
And it's quite deliberate to be organised.
Of course, and it's quite astounding that we're kind of okay with it in a way. Give us a bit of a portrait of Putin's Russia. I know, I say these sort of assassinations seem to be more common there than those Matryoshka dolls. They are in South Africa too. What are your thoughts about Putin, Russia, and the role of coercive, murderous politics in the post-Soviet era?
Well, Russia has a long history of violence by the state, and if you go back to the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, these were not angels. And I was quite interested that when I looked at the first leaders of the Soviet Cheka, their very first secret police, it means extraordinary commission. And the first leaders were Polish, Latvian, and Jewish. And it was only in 1928 with Nikolai Yezhov that an ethnic Russian became head of what was then the NKVD. 1928 was the first Russian to lead it. So anyway, these minority groups, as it were in charge of the Cheka, the secret police. And what's striking about them is that they all had, like the first one, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was a Polish aristocrat, he could hardly move his face because it had been smashed up with rifle butts by the Tsarist police. They all had evidence about their person of maltreatment. Anyway, the other thing is that there's a rather good Russian novel I read earlier last year by somebody called Sergei Lebedev called Untraceable, which is about poisonings by the Russian state. And again, that interest and resort to chemical or nuclear nerve agents goes back a long way. They were trying out poisons back in the 1920s. This is not a new thing, poisoning. And indeed, the Tsarists, of course, Rasputin was poisoned, wasn't he, with poisoned cupcakes. Anyway, the reason this is happening, I think, is because, first of all, when you destroy the rule of law at home, which Putin undoubtedly has done, you create a climate with anybody with the power and the money can get away with anything. And I recommend you all go and watch a marvelous Russian film called Leviathan, which it's about a sort of rather rackety guy who owns quite a nice timber-framed house on the Barents Sea, right up in the north of Russia. And some local oligarch wants to get his hands on the house to knock it down to build luxury condominiums. And indeed, they just destroy this man's life using the courts, the church, you name it. They wreck his life. And in the end, they put him in prison for 20 or 30 years, on bogus charges. So just go and watch that. And if you create that climate, then the idea of, assassinating journalists or dissidents or anyone who gets in your way becomes, quite possible. And even business transactions. I mean, in the 90s, there was something called the Aluminium Wars, where organized criminals and businessmen, I have to be careful what I say here about the businessmen, were vying to control the Russian aluminum industry, to end up with one big mega conglomerate. And 400 people were shot or blown up in the course of what were called the Aluminium Wars. So it's a rough old place, it's like the Wild West. So what he's doing now is, in a sense, a continuation of that, and using operatives from either the state intelligence services, which is the FSB and the SVR, or using something slightly separate, which is the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, to send them abroad and kill people. And they do.
As do most of the other, you mentioned Israel as well has a track record too in assassinations. In South Africa, King Shaka himself comes to lead the Zulu kingdom through an assassination. Yeah. So as we head towards the end of this exhilarating, climb through our own homicidal rages, this is clearly something. Either we're going to get to a point where globally and internationally we make law about assassinations, or is it more likely that we're likely to continue as we always have done since we were bipedal and able to pick up a bone and bash your nearest
Well, no, there have been various. I mean, what I found quite interesting writing this book was that there were, for example, if you go back to the early modern period, the 16th, 17th centuries, literally within a generation, monarchs who had no inhibitions about paying professional killers who you could find to go and kill somebody from the rival faith. So, as Philip II of Spain was a very Catholic ruler of Spain, he put out cash bounties to kill William the Silent of the Netherlands, big money in gold coins, and somebody did kill him to collect the money. But within literally a generation, which is 25 years or so, his successors, like Philip III, Philip IV, said, if people said, let's assassinate somebody, they said, oh, no, we don't do it. It's dishonourable to do that. We're not doing that. With the slight caveat that, of course, by that time they were sufficiently sophisticated to judicially murder people by putting them on trial for treason and getting a quick result from the judges. So it didn't really matter anyway. But they did, on the whole, not want to do it. It was something seen as sneaky, a sneaky thing to do. And you certainly didn't do it with an rival enemy commander on the battlefield. That was really bad practice. So then you get attempts later in international law to try and, calm things down and regulate this a bit. You get laws of war where it is specified that you should not try to assassinate enemy commanders, certainly not by doing things like putting on the enemy's uniform to get in there and kill them. That was all allowed. But then I think in some countries there's been an erosion of those sorts of inhibitions. I mean, in the case of Britain, I can tell you, I'm not breaching any secrets, that when the then Foreign Secretary, David Owen, came out with the mad idea of having Idi Amin in Uganda assassinated, the then head of our secret intelligence service just got up and said, sorry, Foreign Secretary, we don't do that sort of thing. Now, I'm sure they still would not be inhibited about putting you in harm's way, say a terrorist, so that somebody else kills them. And there's a lot of that in my book too. But I don't think they would carry out a direct assassination themselves. And I think they pretty much stopped doing that, certainly in the 60s, by the late 60s. They do not kill people. French is a slightly different matter, because I was just reading about a sort of complex murder trial going on in Paris, where two of the murderers were former French intelligence officers, and apparently there is a training school for French assassins. But the French have always been a bit sort of active in this regard. But no, I think the only solutions to this are, one, that I think there's some value in, like, UN reports. So the UN report into Saudi involvement in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, is a very good report. It really names who was responsible for, i.e. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and also investigative journalists like the Bellingcat people who deal with Russia, who use open source intelligence. They've done a fantastic job in at least making very public the people that Putin is sending around to kill people in different countries. Although, of course, there's something, the British football club Millwall, which you've never heard of, their fans have a chant that nobody likes us and we don't care. And there's an aspect of that about the Russians. They really don't give a shit. They're sort of showing you that they can reach out and get you. And they don't mind if any other intelligence services or states pick it up and publicise it. The benefit for them in terms of sowing terror in the minds of people abroad is higher than being caught doing it.
Absolutely. Michael, thank you very much for a wonderful hour long.
We got all these questions. We got all these questions.
Well, we're going to. Who actually killed JF Kennedy? You want to go there 5 minutes before we leave?
No, I don't.
I don't think you do.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
I highly recommend this book to anybody interested in history. You make history come alive. For people who might be jaded about it, there are a lot of concerns, modern concerns around morality, and just a great, fabulous read. You bring to life. I'm there with that ticking bomb near Hitler. So, Michael, thank you very much for your time, and we do hope to see you in South Africa. And thank you for.
Yeah, I hope so. No, it's wonderful to do this with a South African audience as well.
Great, and we love to hear from you. So, thank you so much.
Good.
Take care. Take care.
All right. Okay. Bye now. Bye.